Granny D was a guest blogger on my blog long before I started thinking about the issues that I'm going to talk about tonight. And she was an inspiration to me and, of course, to many others. And the conversation we need to have as a country is one which she began us on many years ago. And it's about time that we bring the country to the place she wanted us to be. And we have not much more time before this country finally confronts the questions which she put before us. But I want to start tonight by focusing first on something all of you know. What I think we need to talk about is corruption. Corruption. The problem we face is that our government is corrupt. But the key here is to identify how it is they are corrupt. My favorite statistic from the last presidential election, 0.00042% of America, for those of you doing the numbers, you know that's 132 Americans, gave 60% of the super PAC money spent in that presidential election. Now, what can you say then about democracy in USA land? Well, number one, Supreme Court was completely right. The people have the ultimate influence over elected officials because there is a general election. But only after the funders of campaigns have had their ways with the candidates who wish to run in that general election. And number two, obviously, this dependence upon the funders produces a subtle, understated, maybe camouflaged or not so camouflaged bending to keep those funders happy. Members of Congress and candidates of Congress spend anywhere between 30 and 70% of their time raising money to get back to Congress or to get their party back into power. And the thing we have to think about is, what does it do to them? As they spend their time dialing for dollars, calling people they've never met, asking for the money they need to run their campaigns. As they live that life, as any of us would, they develop a sixth sense, a constant awareness about how what they do might affect their ability to raise money. They become, in the words of the X-Files, shapeshifters, as they constantly adjust their views in light of what they know will help them to raise money. Okay, so here too, in America, we have a democracy, one with two dependencies, one upon the funders and dependency upon the people, competing dependency, conflicting dependency, depending upon who the funders are. Okay, here's point number two. The shifting coalitions of funders that comprise the 0.05% are not getting together to advance the public interest. They're getting together to advance the private interest, their private interest, depending upon whatever issue is on the horizon, whether it's climate change or financial reform or healthcare legislation. But then point number three. The key I said at the beginning to how we should understand what it is about this democracy that is corrupt. Now, by corruption, I don't mean cash secreted in brown paper bags to members of Congress. Indeed, everything I'm describing here is perfectly legal. Indeed, according to the Supreme Court, constitutionally protected. Nothing I'm describing here violates any legal or ethical code. But it is still a corruption relative to the democracy, to the republic, the framers of our Constitution imagined they were giving us. The framers gave us what they called a republic. But by a republic, they meant a representative democracy. And by a representative democracy, they meant, as Federalist 52 describes it, a government that would have a branch that would be dependent upon the people alone. But here's the problem. Our Congress has evolved a different dependence. Not an exclusive dependency upon the people, but increasingly a dependence upon the funders too. This is a dependence too. But it's a different and conflicting dependence from a dependence upon the people alone, so long as the funders are not the people. This is a system designed to save the status quo, and it works against the reforms that both the left and the right would advance. It is a pathological, democracy-destroying kind of corruption. Because in any system where such a tiny proportion of the country exercises such extraordinary control over policy, what that means is that the tiniest fraction of that tiny slice, the tiniest fraction of this tiny slice, has the capacity to block reform. Literally, this is a system that feeds on polarization. It feeds on dysfunction, because polarization and dysfunction paradoxically make it easier to raise money. And the critical point to recognize is that nothing will change in this system ever until we change the system. Whatever your issue is, if it's global warming, or it's healthcare, or it's financial reform, or it's labor issues, or whatever your issue is, the critical thing to recognize is we will have no sensible reform about your issue or my issue until we change the system. Now, that's what we know. But here's what I think we need to believe. We need to believe something about what we can do about this problem. And I want you to think about two things that we need to believe. Number one, this problem can be fixed. And number two, and crucially, New Hampshire is the key to fixing it. Okay, number one, it can be fixed. And to do this would require one statute in the statute books, a statute that would establish what people talk about as small dollar funded campaigns, meaning campaigns where people are contributing small amounts of money or have vouchers for small contributions and use that to fund campaigns, and the government makes it so those contributions are effective enough to make it that candidates can run winning campaigns with small contributions only. So, but the more I think about this problem, the more I've recognized that if it's possible, its possibility starts here. And this is why. The answer to this problem has got to be New Hampshire, and that's because of a simple, obvious fact. Even though it would astonish the framers of our Constitution, they would be appalled with this fact. The fact is today that presidents lead. It is only presidents who lead in major policy reform. And it is the fact that New Hampshire leads presidents. So what those two facts together mean is if we're going to end this corruption, then we need a president to lead to end this corruption. We need a president who's going to take this issue up as the issue. And what that means is that if we're going to have a president who leads on this issue, then New Hampshire must lead the president to this issue, must lead the candidate to this issue. Thank you. It must be the case that corruption, in the sense that I'm talking about it, is the number one issue that people in this state are talking about. The number one issue that candidates running in this state need to address. So how could we make that so? And the simple answer is, as the 400 people who will be running for president in 2016 pump this state full of dollars in hotel bills and things like that, as they go around and speak to you 1,000 times per citizen of the state of New Hampshire, you need to ask them. You need to ask these presidential wannabes one question: how will you end this corruption? How will you end this corruption? At every single event that Republicans and Democrats speak at, there needs to be this one question asked: how will you end this corruption? Now, the fact is, they will not want to say anything about this issue. The most surprising and underreported fact about 2012 is that in July of 2012, Gallup did a poll they conduct every 4 years, asking Americans what are the top issues the next president needs to address. And number 2 on that list was reducing corruption in the federal government. Now, by corruption, Americans were not thinking about Rob Blagojevich or Jack Abramoff. Those issues were years before. The corruption in July 2012 that Americans were thinking about was the corruption of the Citizens United money that was everywhere and reported again and again. What Americans were saying is, this system stinks. This is the corruption of our system, and this is the second most important issue to Americans to address. 87% of people identified this as one of the top issues. But if you turn to the presidential campaigns and see what they said about this, the number 2 issue to Americans, they said nothing. Absolutely nothing. Neither Obama nor Romney's website even mentions the issue. And indeed, it is the only issue on the top 10 that was not even mentioned by either candidate. And I had a researcher look at this to go back as far as we could see, to see what other issues over the past presidential elections were in the top 10 but not mentioned by either candidate. And it is the first time in as long as we can see when an issue was in the top 10 according to we the people, but completely invisible according to the candidates. The first time. So this is the sense in which we the people have now turned in one direction, and they, the government, the candidates, have turned in another direction, and this is exactly why they won't want to talk about this issue. So if we sit there silently, quietly, passively, politely, in the audience as they give you their talks about how they're going to produce jobs, or how they're going to deal with the deficit, or how they're going to address the tax problem or financial reform, if you sit there passively and let them go on and on and on, this will never be mentioned. And if this is never mentioned, this country will never recover from this corruption. The only people who can change the dynamic are you. But the critical question is whether the people can make the candidates address it. So they won't talk about it. We must, or you must. You must, if I can borrow a word my mother, who comes from the South, liked to use a lot, rebel against them. Indeed, you need to foment what we could think of as a rebellion against this way of ignoring this, the most important issue facing our democracy. We can rebel against them by saying we, the people, will not talk about the issues they want to talk about until they address the number 1 issue that we should be caring about. This number 1 issue, this question of how will you end this corruption? A rebellion. So imagine something that began to be understood as the New Hampshire Rebellion. The New Hampshire Rebellion. A rebellion inspired by an extraordinary woman. A rebellion that tries to do 2 things over the course of the next 2 years. One thing it does is to sponsor many talks like this, where we invite a wide range of people who care about this issue as passionately as Granny D did and as many of the people in this audience did. We need New Hampshireites to do one thing, to ask every candidate, how will you end this corruption? So that over the next 2 years, we train the people of the state to focus on this issue. Not because most people care deeply about this abstract issue of corruption, but because we get people to recognize that it's only if we address this abstract issue of corruption that we can address the most crucial issues this nation must solve. So always, every time one of them speaks, there is one question they have to address, and that is the essence of what could be the New Hampshire Rebellion. And magically, there are buttons you can take and put on your shirts. Hashtag NHR. This must start, this rebellion. It must start. And it will only start in a place like this. Ben Franklin, when he was carried from the Constitutional Convention in 1787, was stopped in the streets of Philadelphia by a woman who said, "Mr. Franklin, what have you wrought?" And Franklin said, "A republic, madam, if you can keep it. A republic. A representative democracy. A government dependent upon the people alone." There is no doubt we have lost that republic. Inexcusably, outrageously, tragically, unjustly, we have lost that republic. And all of us must work, must find a way to get it back. And it may be that a rebellion here would get it back. It's that hope that I beg you to believe. Thank you very much. Thank you.